Yeah, well, welcome everybody to the, I have to read the title of the stakeholder group on the role of Depackagers in managing food waste. I'm Josh Kelly with the Solid Waste Program, and we have a good group gathered here at National Light, and then we have a small group on the phone and online with other folks joining us. Dan Gutman should be here in about 15 minutes, but let's get started. If anyone in the room wants an agenda, I have some. And I think for anybody online, Ben and Mia have sent around links to the agenda and other documents, which we might be reviewing today. And the one I'm wondering about is the draft hierarchy options. How do people get access to that? Is that at the FTP site?
The draft hierarchy options? What do you mean by that?
That working document we
the suggestions?
How does that get to other stakeholders if they were interested in it?
It went out to all the stakeholders this morning. It's also posted to the FTP site. It's not published anywhere yet, so I can try to attach it to the chat here. Maybe that would work.
Okay, that works for me. All right, so at the top of the agenda, we put two of the charges for the group, only because last time we discussed continuing on the hierarchy discussion and also seeing if we could get time to get into source separation. Aaron, I think you were not here at the last meeting, right? This is our third meeting? Fourth. Thank you, Steve. Yeah, fourth. And we had spent some time, each person going around talking about their experience with the hierarchy, how they approach it, what it's like in their work and their world and their, experience with it. And so we put you on the agenda because we hadn't gotten an opportunity to hear from you, and you represent a bunch of stakeholders.
Oh, and there's Jenna too, who's able to join us.
Oh, awesome. Jenna, welcome. We're just getting started. And anybody who's on virtual, let us know if you can't hear or if anything is difficult audio-wise. So Jenna, I think there's an agenda that Mia sent around, and Ben, plus Ben sent this draft of working ideas that the agency came up with that we'll talk about maybe a bit more later on in the agenda. So at the top of the agenda is the charges for the group, whether there's recommendations on whether the organics management hierarchy should apply to each generator of organic waste, and then 2, whether the agency's A&R should modify its existing policy around source separation of organic waste. So I'm going to stop my blather and just say that Ben has done a lot of work to think about speakers for you guys, and he's got some people sort of teed up, but I want to make sure we don't run out of time to talk about what you want, how you want them to come and engage with this group. But let's go first, if we can, to the hierarchy. And Aaron, does it feel too much to just put the spotlight on you right away on that? Do you want me to do any more background on our discussions?
So I guess I'll jump right in. I will be 100% transparent. I represent retailers. I don't work with the hierarchy. But in talking with members, I think there's been some feedback. They understand the intent, but I guess there were a lot of questions on why Vermont has its own hierarchy compared to EPA, and they feel that there's potential, I think, in moving closer or just moving to the EPA's food recovery hierarchy. I did hear some information about the UVM study showing that it's not necessarily a DPAC issue when it comes to plastics in the soil. I think that we do need to really pay more attention to anaerobic digestion versus composting, and there were questions on why anaerobic digestion and composting were in the same portion within Vermont's hierarchy. You know, and there are different, there's different feedback when it comes to what we should be thinking about, meaning we do need diverse options here in Vermont, and we shouldn't be picking and choosing one over the other. So I think, you know, again, I don't live this, but my members had some feedback, and I think it would be valuable in having a retailer who does live it come in and talk with the group as well.
Ben, I thought we had a retailer. Was Hannaford's on the list? Did I see that at
I
one
think
point?
they are, yeah.
Hannaford's, yeah, was on the list. We've reached out to and spoken directly with Brent Demers from City Market, and he's
He'll be great, too.
tentatively scheduled for the November 30th meeting.
The other thing that I was wondering in looking at that list is we don't have anybody who, a company that creates the actual technology. And maybe talking a little bit
The
about
packaging technology?
Yeah, maybe talking a little bit about, you know, the improvements that have been made and what the data shows in that improvement.
Kevin Bertretti, probably.
With
Scott.
Scott's.
I'll send you his contact if you want.
Okay. Thanks, Aaron. Anything else you wanted? That's good. I just didn't want to cut you off. So for Jenna, last time we had participants asked for each participant to get to share their perspectives on the hierarchy kind of and their experience with it. And I guess you have a unique perspective as a food manufacturer. Is there, so any thoughts you want to share, I guess, floor is yours.
Can I look at the hierarchy? I can't think of what the hierarchy is,
Yes.
honestly.
Yes,
Sorry.
no problem. Maybe Mia, I don't know if you're able to share screen, or Mia or Ben, if you're able to share screens.
I mean, in general, you know, Ben & Jerry's is part of a global company, Unilever. And so, you know, factories both in the United States, North America, and globally always try to synergize on their practices because they're always benchmarked against one another. So anything that's different in Vermont versus other ice cream factories in the US is going to be looked at sort of problematically because it makes things more complicated from a business perspective. And then also, I'm not looking at the hierarchy, but you know, the cost of you know, responsible disposal is always top of mind for a business creating that, you know, inherently creates food waste in the manufacturing process. We also have some concerns always about, you know, where any residual foods are going and making sure that our brand integrity is always protected. And so there's our procurement teams always want to have a lot of control around exactly where waste is going. So like, for example, Unilever has like a no landfill policy. So like we don't dispose of any waste or any trash, I would say, in Vermont. It gets exported. Not to say that's right or wrong. It's just a company policy. Yeah. So I guess, I mean, is this hierarchy? Is this like the law? Like if does that mean that like if a company had food waste and they didn't feed people, but instead they destroyed their food waste, that's against the law? I don't really understand what the hierarchy means, or if it's just mostly a reference for people who don't know what's best to do with their food residuals.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of what you guys have been tasked with making recommendations on. So the hierarchy is in state law. And if you want me, you can bring up the old version of Act 148 on the universal recycling page.
You want the actual, do you want the
It-
photo
it's-
or you want the law?
The law itself,
Sure.
even though that's outdated on page, I think it's 21, that part hasn't changed. At least not the higher part of it. Mike O'Grady did make some changes down below. The bottom line, I think, Jenna, is that there is a policy. It said it is the policy of the state that food residuals collected under the requirements of this chapter. So basically the food waste ban and the requirements on generators to follow that, that they shall be managed according to the following order of priority uses. And that triangle that Mia showed you was essentially these priority uses just written into statute. So reducing food waste at the source, diversion for human consumption, diversion for animal or agricultural uses, composting, land application, and digestion.
Yeah.
And so it is in the law, and the way we have applied it is that it is recommended, and there is concerns that it is required and should be enforced by some. And I don't know if I have that accurately, but that's been part of the discussion here. And that's what this group is charged with.
Yeah.
Considering.
I mean, I feel like from Ben and Jerry's perspective, having it as a recommendation would be what we would want to keep it as. I think that it can be complicated. It's a bit complicated, you know, like, for example, you know, we send a lot of our food residuals for digestion, and part of that is because we have climate goals and there's opportunities to potentially recoup either renewable natural gas or electricity, which helps towards our sustainability goals. And if we're diverting it to animal feed, for example, we're creating more methane emissions through the feeding of a dairy product to an animal. So it contradicts our climate goals, and I think that would happen for any company with a science-based target. So I think that there's more considerations. We wouldn't want to be dictated, I guess, where we need to send it and in what order.
Okay. Thank you. Billy, we heard from you last time, right? We heard from Billy last time.
I don't think Billy was here.
Yeah.
Billy, if I skipped over you, please go ahead and add your thoughts on hierarchy.
I believe I may have been in the midst of
Yeah, he
COVID,
did.
so even if I did respond, it may have been incoherent. So my first question with regard to the hierarchy is, how was the determination made to conflate anaerobic digestion and composting when the EPA food recovery hierarchy differentiates? What were the data points that were looked at to reduce the number of strata from 6 to 5? What academic resources were consulted to make sure that the state of Vermont was making a decision that was consistent with data and science, especially considering Vermont was choosing to move to be on its own island, where 49 other states adhere to the EPA's food recovery hierarchy? What did Vermont look at to determine the Vermont hierarchy is a superior model compared to the EPA model?
I'll be honest, I didn't live it at the legislature. Kathy Jameson, my predecessor, did. Tom, you shared last time that you talked with her a bunch, and I remember her saying that there was conversations with Pat Sagley. Pat Sagley is the previous executive director of the Composting Association of Vermont. Natasha Duarte is here. Maybe you have perspective.
The basic premise of the whole thing was that, and I'm, you know, that working down, basically it was an effort to look at efficiency. And so obviously, like so there's the waste reduction part of it. That's as long as recycling has been around, we've obviously all agreed just reducing the waste is the first thing. The next two, feeding humans and feeding animals, it's a reuse framework as opposed to a recycling framework. So the idea basically is, if food is already food, why recycle it and try to have to turn it back into more food in order to feed those people? So it's a no-brainer to feed people with edible food first, and likewise with livestock. And I'm not sure what Jenna's reference to that being less efficient than, say, making methane is. Making food is definitely a lot of science out there that food is the most important thing versus making energy. And so with composting and methane, there was a variety of things that were discussed. Among other things, one of the big priorities was figuring out, because this was originally grounded with a connection to the farm to plate efforts in Vermont, that decentralization was really important, and that we wouldn't want to have a handful of digesters around the state that we were then trucking material farther distances to, whereas you can set up local community-based composting facilities very cheaply and easily and keep resources in the economy. So there's a couple of driving factors that I don't think the EPA was really factoring in terms of changing the resource distribution, and I think that was sort of the main driver of that.
So just internal discussion about what would the priorities be and what the hierarchy would be, not necessarily a process that involved data gathering and science.
Well,
Is that
having
correct?
spent a lot of time in those spaces, that there aren't full life cycle analysis to really challenge like the global economy versus the local economy adequately, and whether you're sending energy out to the global economy or whether you're producing food locally. So some of these are about sort of aggregating information, but then having to synthesize it and make judgment calls. And I think that's kind of how that happened. And honestly, if you chase the EPA stuff, there's not actually much data behind that either. It's a certain amount of its judgment call as well, of just replacing inputs. So I think the drive was towards a more local economy that was able to retain resources and distribute them more broadly. Having more players at the table, more beneficiaries.
And I'll take a quick look at the legislative wedge page and see if I can't find any tracking changes of what happened and when, or any documentation that supports that, since none of us were really involved in that process. But that all happened in legislature.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Ben. Yeah.
I mean, I'll just give one example, like the EPA WARM model, like it doesn't include any imbued energy and materials, for instance, or in the infrastructure development. So even their climate calculator models aren't full life cycle systems. You know, it's pretty basic stuff.
Billy, do you want to share other thoughts you have on the hierarchy from your stakeholder perspective as a digester operator?
I would just like to echo Jenna's sentiment, because we are operating facilities in states beyond the borders of Vermont. So we look for consistency as well. And we are adhering to the EPA food recovery hierarchy in the other states where we have operating digesters, and in those states where we are developing digesters, and plan to continue to do so. So Vermont will be an anomaly for us in our practices.
But it wouldn't, Billy, it would apply to the generators of waste materials. So unless you're generating them personally, it's the generator's responsibility to adhere to the hierarchy and make sure they're following that, just to be clear.
Correct. So not as far as following it, but just as far as our approach to our partnerships with those commercial food waste generators.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Billy. I saw a hand up earlier from Caroline Gordon. Hey, Caroline, if you're still with us and you have a question or a comment, feel free.
Yeah, thank you so much for allowing me to ask a question there, because I really understood Jenna also saying that Ben & Jerry's actually does have a policy in place that kind of harmonizes their production sites across Unilever to divert food residuals not to the landfill. And in terms of the hierarchy, I think it's always missed to really analyze what services are available for a certain kind of food waste. And in terms of the consistency of ice cream, for example, as a food waste, I think when you talk to Casella and the Depackager dealing with that, you will hear a story about how that material is actually not really eligible for composting or animal feed, and because of its consistency. So then doing what they're doing, if we haven't heard an analysis what were to be the appropriate way in accordance with the hierarchy to go about that specific food residual. And so I wouldn't say what's currently happening there is not in accordance with the hierarchy and sort of an example of the hierarchy working well. For consideration or as a question to the group to speak specifically about how things are or are not in alignment.
And for if anybody is new who's joined us as Matt or anyone else who hasn't been here, maybe you have, or people who are on virtually, feel free to use the raise hand function or put yourself on video and wave or something. But in Teams, you can raise your hand and I can try and recognize you. I want to. The timing of this group is always an issue when we're up against a pretty tight time clock. So I want this again to be your meeting, and I want to say that. There's a lot. We started with speakers. We sent you a ton of speaker. You guys had some speaker ideas. Ben's already got a few of those lined up. We couldn't get anybody for today. We also looked at a lot of questions that you might have. And Tom, I think you submitted a bunch and others might have as well. And you can decide where you go, as always, with this charge. We put this document together. I give a lot of credit to Ben Gothier, who's got a lot of great ideas in here. And then I just went deep with Ben and I went deep sort of towards the second and third page to try and say, well, what would it look like to change some of these policies as they are now? And Ben, if you want to unmute and say anything about any of that, please do,
Yeah, I sort of said it in the email this morning, but initially that document was generated because the group last time around, I think Peter Blair had mentioned some alternatives that could be implemented to focus in on certain user groups of certain sizes and kind of have a targeted approach. And the question was raised, is there any other means of the state sort of leveraging non-enforcement methods to increase generator compliance with the hierarchy, reducing food waste first, donating food waste second, and so on and so forth. So the top half of that letter was just, or that document was just created to have some alternatives, like different means that we could do or implement to try to encourage people to comply without the enforcement hammer. So that's kind of where that came from. And the second half is kind of sort of a visioning process, because we thought it might be helpful for the group to have something to review and look at and comment on, just to avoid having to come up with it in, out of thin air. So we sort of took a few of the things and plugged them into a potential framework, just as a starting point to discuss the policy. So that's kind of the next step as I see it. But the first part, the top part, is just the hierarchy, suggestions to improve compliance with the hierarchy. And it's just a list for your thoughts.
Folks want to spend any time on that? You want me to walk through some parts of that? I want to make sure what's helpful to you.
Well, I just want to say thanks to Ben and whoever else worked on that, because you can tell there's a lot of work that went into that and a lot of thought behind it. I read through it once when it came this morning. I haven't had a whole lot of opportunity to really digest it. I think going through it, it'd take us the rest of the meeting probably to go through it in depth, or even more. But I think it'd be helpful to.
Let me break it up into two chunks. And Ben, feel free to chime in. The chunks that I see are there's a lot of voluntary stuff. There's even federal policy ideas. There's a whole bunch of stuff in here. And then there's the second part where, the two things that you guys have on your charge to talk about, what should be done with the hierarchy and what should be done with the agency's policy on store separation. I decided to try and unpack that and let it see where it goes and use other states that I'm aware of as models for how laws have been applied around food rescue. So I'm happy to maybe start there, but if that feels premature, say so. Again, it's awkward for me to lead but not lead, so I'm trying to make sure it fits what your desires are.
I did have a question as far as the hierarchy. So is that something that Can it apply multiple times over as a waste is handled? So let's say somebody drops.
Like how sweet can you get your
Packaged food and that's processed. Is the waste hierarchy still in effect after that's processed, or is it like once, kind of one stop? So that's part of my question.
Like a donation site getting something and then deciding that it's not gonna be for people and then they.
Would they have to continue multiple times over on that hierarchy? And then the other question I have, and it's just trying to understand around a generator. Would a depackaging facility, they're taking in waste, would that depackager then be a generator too?
The way the law reads is no person shall knowingly, there's multiple parts of a 50-page universal recycling law. And the landfill ban part sort of stands on its own. It says no person shall knowingly dispose of these materials. We've had a bunch of hauler meetings, and I don't mean to throw Casella under the bus. We've talked with Casella and many other haulers and many other facilities about knowing disposal. Had a lot of conversations around recycling with knowing disposal. And I think the case can be made that when you're now controlling that waste and you decide, well, I collected the recyclables, but I'm going to throw them in the trash and I'm the hauler or something, that's still knowing disposal and you could be culpable for that. The issue of the hierarchy adds a whole other layer of complexity in a way when you talk about how often does the hierarchy apply. It's an interesting, I don't know the answer to it.
All right, yeah, that redundancy seems like it
Yeah.
could be challenging. Yeah.
I was going to say the way I look at it, Steve, is that once the generator has sent it to one of the buckets, it sort of precludes any other management option, right? Like if you divert food for reuse or consumption, and then that kitchen has some waste scraps, they're not going to be then having to divert those for further consumption because they've already deemed them to be inedible or parts that they don't need. So then it goes further down. So it's just kind of, there's no requirement for that person to then follow the hierarchy. It's just going to follow the natural progression of things. And to your second question, the way that we look at it, at least from a permitting standpoint, is the DPAC is the treatment facility. It's not a generator. So the generators create the waste, sort of separate the waste, and then send it, in accordance with the hierarchy for management. But we would look at the facilities as, treatment facilities. And that includes composters and et cetera. So that's kind of how we look at it from a permitting standpoint.
Yeah, and I forgot, there is another part of the law that says haulers have to manage that material according to the hierarchy. Haulers, because there's requirements in the original universal recycling law required all haulers to offer trash. Trash was the trigger. If you offer trash collection, you have to eventually offer food scrap collection. That they manage that material separate from trash according to the hierarchy. And further, facilities that collect trash needed to offer food scrap collection, and they're required in the law to manage that according to the hierarchy. That's what it says, according to the hierarchy. So that is written into there. So I think it does kind of depend. We've always said to generators, haulers, facilities, you have to be managing it in some way according to the hierarchy. One of those uses needs to be used. They're acceptable. We prioritize the top one and on down, but you have to use one of them.
I apologize. Is generator defined in statute?
No, we talked about that last time a little bit. But
Okay,
it's
I
not.
apologize.
It's not a.
And can I just explain where I'm coming from? So generator is used within this draft several times, but you've got small generators of packaged food such as convenience stores and gas
Right.
stations.
Right.
But wouldn't the generator be the consumer that opens the package and throws it out or throws away the apple core or?
Once they buy it, they become the generator. It generally applies to anybody who is at the end of that useful life of that material in this sort of consumption sense.
Yeah.
So if a store isn't selling it, then they're generating material on the back end. And if somebody buys it and then they don't eat the core of that apple, they're the generator once they get home.
But you're right, there is no defined term of generator. When it talks about what we call generators in the solid waste world, it says a person who produces more than shall do these things, shall separate food residuals from other solid waste, provided that a de minimis amount, blah, 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 and send them for uses according to the hierarchy. Consistent with the priority uses established under subdivisions A 2 through 5, which
I just, my concern is what's the impact on the retailer or the hauler or the people, the businesses or the people down the stream after the consumer, who is the generator, right? Doesn't put it in the proper receptacle. Like what does that impact? That's my concern, because that's
I mean,
a
that's.
huge issue, right?
hopefully I'm understanding.
So you go to you get someone traveling through the state,
Yeah.
right? And they,
Put a ketchup package in the compost.
right,
Right.
they're filling up their gas tank, they clean out their car, they put all the trash into a trash bin, but maybe there's
Or maybe they
compost
put it in the recycle bin.
or yes. You know, so is that now on the retailer to clean it out,
We-
or is it
Right.
Or is it when we
On
get
the
there that
hauler.
we say it's
Hauler,
contaminated?
Yeah.
right?
And Aaron, I had a question about generator not being defined previously too. I found it confusing.
We've always approached it. And we do spot checks as well, where we go and look at loads at transfer stations occasionally. We've always tried to approach it, find the real generator of the waste.
Mhm.
At that gas station example where you clean out your car and the Coke cans go in the trash can, we have really, with the whole rollout of the law, prioritized the service being available. And sometimes, like in the case, me and I've been working with parks this past 2 years, actually more like 4, making sure that if somebody asks, there's an option for them for that material, even though I can't say the facility has to have a compost bucket at the state park. Because it doesn't spell them out in law. The State House, and as Kim pointed out, the recycling bin that's not here today, that is in the law. So I'll get it next time.
I didn't want to write it up.
So, but I think what we're starting to get into is getting into it a little bit, which is okay. And I kind of encourage you guys to get into it a bit. We thought we can't really come up with ideas unless we get into it a bit.
Right.
So let me just outline that a little bit.
One more point to that, though. I think from like Tom's perspective of when they crafted the law, they wanted smaller on site, and then you tied it to the haulers having to collect it as well. So now you have these smaller niche, not that Tom can handle a certain amount of volume. As soon as you get up to our size, there's a lot more material coming. So yes, we do send material to Green Mountain Compost and other bigger compost sites, but if that smaller facility can't handle it, we then have a ton of material that we have to send for anyway, right? So I think that's the other thing, is the network didn't grow as expected, probably when they passed the law, that there were a bunch of small composters that popped up. If you look at the landscape 10 years later, I would say there's probably half or maybe 25% of what originally thought they were going to get into the compost business.
Well, but it doesn't, the law doesn't require you to send to a small facility. It just, the purpose of the question, I was answering the question of just sort of why put those things together and why deviate from EPA piece. And I think it was just simply trying to, there's so many words in the document you're about to go through, like support. Well, how do you support it? You create the conditions for success. There's no mandate in there to go to a small facility.
But I'm just take the small facility. We need capacity as haulers to take material to the closest outlet, and sometimes logistically or transportation.
Right.
At some point, if we don't have those viable options, we then do have to do.
And we talked about this a little bit last time, like the willing and able that I brought up with a different context, but that was more around the definition of what is a food waste. And food waste is defined as something that is if it can be managed according to those hierarchy uses. So if the digester won't take it and the composter won't take it and the animal feed won't take it and it's not suitable for human consumption, then we've sort of said, okay, and we've gotten these waste questions before with toxic or challenging materials, right? Which you guys do handle a lot, and then that gets disposed of, and that's how it goes.
Well, I'd be more worried about the smaller generators at the grocery stores and some of the plates and other stuff. that they are putting their food on. With these large generators, we kind of know what the materials are and what's going into them. At the small gas station, whatever that food was on, we don't really know. Does it have PFAS? Does it have these other items on it?
I
Where,
just wanted to ask, I mean, getting into the gas station piece, I don't think we're talking about
Yeah.
collecting at a gas pump. I don't want folks to get confused about that. Like, we kind of blended into, you know, the recycling can and the trash. Like, we're focusing on,
This is much more on the stuff
Larger
that the
scale.
grocery store actually generates. At least in the context of this mock-up, it's like, a big supermarket has this much canned product and then this much produce product, and what do they have to do with that? Because that's what source separation gets into, and that's also what the hierarchy gets into, and they're kind of interwoven.
I'd love to understand too, like what are the other risks of going to animal feed that we're not even thinking about and moving that material
Mhm.
throughout the
Mhm.
state, right? Like,
Right.
I mean, that's another concern for me, just having been in that business a little bit, we kind of steer away from it because of the liability and because of
Yeah.
contamination risk and because, you know, and I get on a smaller scale that may work really well because it's controlled, but as you start going up the scale of material coming in and stuff coming at you, it's harder to control that. And that's where my concern would be that we do more harm.
I leave that to Steve. I don't.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say in that space is it's all comes down to contaminants, you know, and how much is making its way through certain processes and making its way into that feed. I'm not an expert on animal feed in particular, but you also don't need to be, because if you feed an animal things they shouldn't ingest, that's not going to be good. So I think that's kind of the baseline of it. And that was my question as far as generators and kind of my understanding of what's coming out of depackagers. Like a lot of that is not going to be appropriate for animals from my vantage. And so that was kind of a question. If the hierarchy did apply to a depackager, it's just, I could see some challenges there.
I think the question is like with the depacket, maybe we should let Josh go through his thing and then kind of come back to these things, but it's more upstream at that store. If it is edible, are you allowed to send it to a depacker or do you have to send it, say, to a food pantry?
And that was my question about if the hierarchy applies kind of over and over, if it's just with the one.
I think like Ben said, like once it's at the facility, it's a treatment
Yeah.
system, and there's facilities and facilities. So a depackager is an interim step, but it is a treatment process of a kind. Transfer station is an interim step where a lot of food waste does go through. And then a compost facility is a treatment process and then has a product at the end. I guess my point there is that they are not really called out under the hierarchy section. That is really about people who generate waste and what they're supposed to do with it. That's the way it goes right into that. After it talks about the hierarchy of uses, it says a person shall do this. As I said before, the haulers that have to haul food waste and the facilities that collect trash that have to collect food waste as well must send it for one of those hierarchy uses or with those priority uses. And I think that's subject to some interpretation and debate in this group at how that also could be evaluated. But it does refer those haulers and facilities back to the hierarchy. Again, we've always approached it that a transfer station that sends it to a composter is acceptable, or digester or animal feed if they can assure they can do it the right way. We've always deferred to you guys when it comes to that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Aaron, do you have something? So this, I think this document is just to try and help you guys with some ideas. And on the second page, sort of a big disclaimer about, we got to ask for some ideas. So we came up with some ideas, and there's 3 ideas essentially. I made a wrong edit. The third one on source separation should be a number 3. So we'll have to fix that. But essentially the first 2 ideas are ways to support food donation, and they follow a little bit of what I learned about how California was approaching it. The first 2 ideas are about hierarchy support. Number 1 is on food donation. Number 2 is on animal feed. And then the last idea is on source separation. which has a connection back to these other two. And again, we have a report this group has to write with recommendations or not by January 15th. This is completely just ideas. The California model, as we looked it up, does have emphasis in their law about food donation, where I think generators of a certain size must have a written agreement with a food recovery organization. They must maintain records of a type and frequency of the food that they recover. And then there's like this commitment they must not intentionally basically go down on the hierarchy before they look for the edible food. And I added some to this language to try and say, unless that material is not wanted by the food. We talked about cakes last time. For Jenna and Billy and Aaron, we talked about sugary cakes and the limits on the food bank to accept that for people in need. There's only so much cake and other sugar stuff that they might want. So, you know, this is that like willing and able thing kind of put in here as well. And I'm like, I think that gets to what you were talking about. They have to have capacity, they have to be wanting to accept it before you can move down the hierarchy. And then this really puts it on the generator to maintain the records. And in case there's a complaint that the hierarchy is not being upheld, the agency could follow up. In New York State, I think there's a link in the document further on page 1 to some New York annual report forms that generators have to submit to the Department of Environmental Conservation there. I'm not suggesting we want to be handling all that type of reporting. So that's kind of idea 1 to throw out to this group. Idea 2 is also utilizing that same framework for food donation prioritization towards animal feed. And again, it's responding to something Peter Blair said, you focus on the larger generators. So we started to think of only generators above 1 ton, that they would try and seek out any animal feed service providers. They would have to be legal and safe according to the Agency of Agriculture's regulation of that activity. Before,
What would that be?
I think there's had
We
to
don't even
be.
have it right now, right? I mean, there's,
That, this is where we start descending into like, let's just go through it, because that would be for the agency to be in charge of ultimately. I don't think that's the scope of this group.
but we're gonna make a rule without any follow-up rules, right? Is that part of the recommendation,
Yeah,
right?
we can't make every rule.
Okay.
We're talking
Well,
about
we just
the
keep going through it.
framework
Yeah,
that
let's
makes
get
sense
through it.
existed.
okay. Well, essentially, it's the same as number 1. And by the way, number 1 doesn't have a cost implication to it. So and this is especially for someone like Aaron representing retailers, it does not discuss costs. Most food rescue is at no cost, is my understanding, although that could be changing in our world. If there was a cost, one could argue in one's case that I'm a generator, how could you make me go and pay this amount of money to donate this food? And you could use this 10% cost model that New Jersey uses in their organics ban in the food recovery of food donation if you had to. But we didn't even talk about it because I hadn't even considered it. And then in the animal feed case, essentially, when the discussion of cost comes up, it includes this, that if the cost or the alternative for animal feed is 10% more than the cost of the alternative lower hierarchy item of composting and anaerobic digestion, then if the generator could document that, they could get a waiver from the agency of some kind. This is further down below. And this is how New Jersey does it with their food waste ban. If the cost of disposal is versus composting something or sending it to a digester is that the composting and digestion is 10% or greater over cost of disposal, then the person can seek a waiver and try and dispose of that material. And then again, the agency the generator would maintain the records. If there was a request, the agency could ask the generator for those records. Though, Dan Goosen, you talked last time about some feelings you had about composting being higher. Billy also had a discussion about that, where AD and composting sits. If you wanted composting to be higher, you would have to make that recommendation to change it in the hierarchy because currently they're on the same.
But really quickly, just to remind us as a group, the question is not, is it a good hierarchy? The question is not, how should the animal feed laws be implemented? The question is, what extent or how should it be applied? So I think we should just like stay on task with the nature of the question. I don't think we're talking about composting versus digestion right now.
Sounds good. The last one is getting a little bit more in the weeds on source separation. And so I went there because those two things have been talked about together, and it's hard to totally put them into silos. So this is assuming that the current ANR DEC's policy is wiped away in some way, is replaced by something. And it'd be ideal if statute is, if they're going to go in this direction, that is, there's clarity added that generators, if this is the desire of the legislative body to go there, must source separate all food waste from packaging at the point of generation. And then this is sort of allowing for this complex area of heavily packaged foods. So it essentially is suggesting that heavily packaged foods could receive approval by the generator for depackaging rather than source separate. And that it would not be eligible for lightly packaged foods. That would obviously, the next question is, what does that mean? Oh, and then of course, in the case of putting food away for food for people, for food rescue, the packaging would be left intact to ensure the quality of that edible food. That's a whole other piece, but it's worth mentioning. And to separate who's targeted by this rather than not, I think it's important to talk about the smaller generators that may have some of this heavily depackaged food, but very, very little. I'm thinking of a gas station convenience store that may have some canned goods that they don't use sometimes or don't sell that are off spec. That probably could be disposed of through the de minimis clause that's already in the law. This already exists to allow, if you have a program in place for separating your materials, you can, your bulk of your source separated materials, there's a small amount, you can dispose of that right now. And then the next question is, so if this all were to pass, you would end up with two streams. You would end up with your unpackaged source separated food and your packaged food. Next question is, what does the generator have to do with that? It's kind of where it gets back to the hierarchy too. So in option A, you hypothetically, I'll just call it the commingling allowed after cost check model. And then option B is commingling never allowed. So option A is where the cost for the unpackaged food, the generator is then checking to see if, basically to see if there's get bids for the animal feed of that. And if there is a greater, the 10% or greater cost for the animal feed of it, then they could request permission to send it to a lower level on the hierarchy. See, I wrote this
Yeah,
the other
which would
day.
then be
So,
composting or digestion, right?
right.
And then.
And then also it would essentially, in this model, you'd be allowed to commingle it back again with your depackaged food waste.
Not an option.
In option A.
Oh, I thought you were on B already.
Not yet. Yeah. So in option A, if you can justify that there's a 10% or greater cost to sending it to these separate streams, separate composter, separate digester, separate animal feed option versus your depack service, you could put it in the tote with the packaged food or the roll off or whatever. Option B essentially eliminates that. After donating food for people as outlined above and seeking bids for safe legal animal feed, the generator may send any remaining unpackaged source separated residual to a facility that will manage it separately from packaged food residuals through the entire treatment process. That means to a composter that composts only unpackaged food, or to a digester that digests only unpackaged food residual. Essentially that it would be kept until it's a product again, as a digestate spread on land or compost spread on land. And then there's a whole bunch of additional considerations. These are just, we're talking about cost checks a lot here. We're not talking about other, I mean, somebody was bringing up the EPA system and the different life cycle assessments. There's a lot of different life cycle assessments you could apply. Environmental justice could be applied. I wrote down like women minority businesses. I mean, There's a lot of things you could discuss. That's a lot to consider. I'll stop there and feel free to, Billy, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, cost is one consideration, but I think for a lot of our partners, value is a consideration, and they're not the same. So for example, any certified B corporation is required to improve their score over time, and the cost for sending food waste to a certain destination may be lower than sending it to a digester, but the value to that entity in being able to achieve a higher environmental score by getting a lower GHG score is significantly more. So cost is one way of looking at it, but value is another.
That's a great point, Billy. And I think to add on to that, I think some other considerations that might also be as important is environmental impacts, the environmental justice impacts of, waste that are distributed out of state that might be impacting other communities. There's a lot of considerations to make in addition to just cost. So I appreciate that point.
You kind of skipped over the B for additional considerations. I think that one's also pretty important, is distance, because as we know in Vermont, driving stuff any distance, it does add to cost, but it's also got other impacts and got a lot of food going really far away. So not necessarily.
Yep. Feel free to jump back up to the food donation part, the animal feed part, the hierarchy support. These are just ideas. This is, again,
I think one of the things that's come up in a lot of the conversation is sort of the implicit sticking point within the hierarchy around the legislature, at least, is the question of, is it a mandate or is it a recommendation? And that really is embedded within the legislative question that we've been asked to answer. And I think just to contextualize this for those of you that weren't here at the last meeting, one of the things that I was just sharing a little bit was, we had previously had solid waste reduction legislation in the past, Act 78, that mandated 50% recycling by 2005. Yet, but it was all voluntary. It was all voluntary compliance. It was all basically the recommendation side of the equation. And we were only at 32% by 2005. And universal recycling law, to some extent, is a response to that. It's a legislative fix to the problem of how do we actually achieve these goals. We are on a warming planet. We have serious social inequities. We have serious soil health and erosion and water quality issues. How do we do something that's decisive enough that it can ensure that we're bending that arc in the right direction? And so I think that it's one of the things that we're being asked to do is clarify the degree and extent to which this applies and to whom. And I think it's really important to realize that recommendations have never really worked as a public policy to achieve public good. So individual companies will find their own way to that, as Billy's describing and as Jenna's describing. But I think we're trying to look out at a statewide policy, and the hierarchy is essentially, it's a decision-making rubric. It's a focus on highest and best use, and saying we have the social desire to see things go to their highest and best use and not to their highest market value. So Billy, that was a good piece. I appreciate that too. Like market value and highest and best use are not the same thing. So, as I read the recommendations here, and when I think about this, I think that the key thing that we should be asking ourselves is about how do we ensure positive outcomes and not just hope for them. I don't think we want to pass legislation and just cross our fingers, So that piece about sort of how enforceable is it, and to what extent and to whom, I think is the piece that we really need to come back to and give our attention to the details around whether or not something, the hierarchy is not going to insist anybody do something illegal or force somebody to eat a cake if it's edible but not saleable. Like if they don't want to eat it, you're not going to make them eat it, then it goes to the next thing on the list. It's like we can just assume some basic sense of logic and legality here, and then kind of move on to how does the state roll this thing out. So one of the things that we all talked about in the second meeting was just making sure that things got to their highest and best use. So I guess if we don't insist that things go through that rubric, how do we ensure that they end up at their highest and best use?
How do we know that they will? I mean, like you said, 10 years down the road, how do you know that you made the right decision when you do dictate where it's gonna go? And I've just seen it in the recycling industry, right? There's a market that we're doing something with the product, and then all of a sudden we learn something about that product and you're like,
I don't think we'll ever decide that feeding people who are food insecure was a bad decision. Like I think if you go through the hierarchy, these are very, very simple, logical ideas. We don't I think that these are not as complex as sort of, manufactured products. And so, composting and AD, they're on the same line. I don't think this group is in a position to make a judgment call, yes or no, one is better, so that's why we put them together before. We didn't choose to set one against the other. That we felt like that is where the diversified toolbox comes into play. But it's a no-brainer to feed people before it goes into either of those systems,
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I do think there's a lot of devils in the details though, as to how do you then get the exemption if you know something's bad, which we don't have to get into here, but.
Yeah, we can say that's, well, no, but it wouldn't be legal for food. If you know it's bad, then you skip that anyway. Like that's already built in to if the food bank's not willing to take it or it's not safe, you don't have to send it to food rescue. That's not that's, and you move to the next level down,
Okay.
Other thoughts or
Yeah.
reactions?
Well,
Can I ask a question on this? Sorry, page 3.
Sure.
Is this would only be applying to generators in Vermont?
Yes.
So out-of-state generators could skip all this and, you know what I mean? How is it gonna be
I mean,
regulated coming in and going out?
Well,
we don't
similar as
regulate.
we are with cycling.
You can take it.
I was just gonna say, we don't regulate products that are moving through the state, but once they go to the grocery store and are sold, then that becomes the generator. Yeah, I don't know, Kim. I don't think there's is a snag on generators out of state. I will note that New York has a law they're trying to grapple with as well, and they're trying to figure this out.
Are you talking about folks that ship material into Vermont for disposal
And out.
and out of disposal? I think that this would apply to anybody in Vermont that generates material, whether it stays in state or out of state.
We have landfill. I mean, we see that already at Triple T Trucking as a transfer station. There's a lot of material going through, and I was there, and they had the bags from Vernon, New Hampshire come in from residential waste, and I can kind of tell now when there's a lot of food waste, and there's other things that are weighty, but you guys know, it's like when it hits the ground, the bag has like a certain weight to it, and you can see that in those bags from Vernon. And then you saw a bag come in from a transfer station in south of Rutland, starts with a W. I can't think of it. Wallingford. It might have been Wallingford, and it was like fluffy little bags that just tumbled out, no recyclables clanking around. It was just noticeable. And then they separated those off, and the stuff from Vernon went back, was going to a New York landfill. They had 2 trailers there that day. They packed that one into that. They actually separated those blue bags. They
So
were
it came to Vermont and then it was
it
sent.
goes back out because it's not had a solid waste plan that conforms to the state's plan. Yeah, it must move back. Or essentially,
What's the environmental impact on that?
Wait,
with that
can we please do the work we came here to do and just stay focused on the question that
I think we need to understand like the impact though. It's not as simple.
No, the
I mean,
stuff from
if we're
Massachusetts
just
doesn't matter.
going to make the But it does, right? If we're just going to make a recommendation on whether the hierarchy should apply to everybody, yes or no? We can literally say yes or no right now. Should the agency modify their existing policy? Like, we need to understand the impact, like we were just talking about, the cost, the value, the environmental distance, like
But
that all weighs into these
these transfer
recommendations.
stations and these things don't pertain to the hierarchy. There could be a question later.
But it does, because it didn't meet the hierarchy, so it shipped in from New Hampshire and.
No, I don't think
I think
that's,
that example was confusing because that was referring to municipal solid waste, like residential curbside coming from a household. Again, I think we're talking about the larger scale generators here, dialing this back, like 1 ton is like the grocery stores and they're not going to a transfer station in little bags to get segregated.
Yeah, we don't regulate the person in that who produces the waste.
Yeah.
We do regulate the waste that tries to get disposed of here. But
What
not,
about the
with
waste
the-
that is leaving the state and being disposed of somewhere else?
we also regulate that. And so, technically, that should not have landfill banned items in it. I think it's perfect, but the hierarchy would have been way, way up at the generator level. I mean, essentially what we're talking about today is businesses or institutions that are in Vermont. That's what this clause applies to, and that's who's discussed. Because the next part after the hierarchy is, and Ben, maybe we should, Ben, I think you had on the website, you did get up the statute, right? Like you did a Word document with some of the synopses of the statute.
The charges?
Not the charges, but the definition of the hierarchy.
I can show that.
Yeah, that was from one of the earlier meetings. That's posted on the FTP site now. And
You want
Kim, I
that?
didn't want to lose track of your question. I think I can come back and answer that to you maybe offline about the facilities that accept out-of-state organics, and we can close that loop for you.
I actually think it's linked to it from the.
What do you wanna see,
Depackager
though?
webpage.
That's what
There's,
I'm on.
it's the actual hierarchy statute.
This is it right
Oh,
here.
you got it right there.
Yeah.
All right, so you see it starts with, this is a policy of the state, food residuals collected, managed by the hierarchy, and these are the 5 things. And then it starts with the person who produces more than, this is because the original part of the law had the phase-ins of the 2-ton generator, 1-ton generator. But again, I mean, this whole section has always been waste generators in Vermont. We don't have jurisdiction over waste generators out of Vermont. I can't tell the supermarket in New Hampshire what to do.
But Josh, the exception to that rule is when we permit a solid waste facility that accepts out-of-state waste.
Right.
Those facilities then do have to have procedures in place to be screening for contaminants in the incoming organics. So all the composters and organics treatment facilities have to have that in place. So it is caught in a different way.
Yep, thanks. Dan, you had something you were going to say. Maybe we should.
Well, just, you asked for reflection on this. I think the, the hierarchy for food donation, it seems like that's a pretty minimum ask that big grocery stores, I don't know how many of them are a ton or more, but it would be a lot. And I guess that a lot of them probably already do have written agreements with food recovery organizations, so it doesn't seem like it would be a huge step to require that they have that. And then in terms of like the enforcement of it or the reporting of it, I'm less familiar, but it seems like, why not do that? And I don't know that 1 ton's the right number, but it, as an idea, the California model for making sure that somebody over a certain size thinks about food for people first, and that's not being skipped, seems like a no-brainer to me. The animal feed one, I think people have mentioned why that gets trickier. It still seems like a laudable goal. And depending on, I mean, maybe it could be written in such a way that it's very clear, like, okay, if there's any potential for any plastic or whatever being in this stream, then no, it goes to the next level or whatever, but. So that one's less clear to me.
That's like 90% of compost though, right?
What's that?
Like any food scrap product, right? Wouldn't you say that there's at least a less than 1% chance that there's gonna be some sort of contamination?
90% of food going to.
I would say any food waste stream that you pick up, that you will have at least one speck of plastic.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the right number is. I
mean,
Yeah, but I think that's just a question, right? So we'll have some contamination. So how do you set a threshold that we can actually live with, that we can visibly understand too?
I don't
Wouldn't
think,
ag folks be speaking to that? And it's not a threshold, but you're the ones who are regulating, right? The animal feed.
Yeah, animal
So that-
feed.
It's not gonna,
and
we're not setting that threshold.
I think-
But I do think to that point, if there is, I think the fundamental problem here is animal feed is on this hierarchy, but especially with packaging in the mix, that's very challenging. And so anything that can be done to reduce that, I mean, I look at option B under 2 for source separation, and I think
supposed to be 3, sorry.
that, that's all right. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. It helps split that plastic off, but then I also understand where that's really challenging for a digester or a facility all the way through to separate those 2 waste streams. And so I think,
Not hard to separate them. I think you still have contamination, even in the source separated food. So it's not that because you have one package stream and you have source separated, that source separated is 100% clean. Like when we looked at our source separated stream with UVM, like there was a lot of contamination that was pulled out of that stream, probably more than the packaging. So when you're looking at both of them on an even playing field, and maybe that's because there wasn't enough education about, hey, we're not going to collect it, or hey, we got to be stricter on the hauling side and say we're throwing this bin away if there's too much contamination. But I would say every composter, and you're more the composters, there's going to be contamination in that source separated food scraps as well. It's just they screen at the back end, we screen at the front end, right? So I think that's the thing. There is going to be contamination, if we can agree.
Yeah, I don't think we're gonna make contamination go away 100%. I also don't think that we have to, that there's a rubric by which all animals receiving any food, I'm sure the agency would have opinions on it, but like all the folks who are feeding chickens food would be more than happy, I would believe, taking segregated loads from a grocery store if all the packaged material is going elsewhere, with some education and making sure that they've got an agreement that works for both sides. But, you can have a napkin or even a piece of plastic in a big mix of food and probably not kill your chickens, I would guess. So I don't know. I don't know if it's black and white on the animal feed issue.
The only thing I'll add, and I think Mike has a point about contamination, absolutely, is that there are hauling companies that do food for animals at grocery stores now, that are there now, and they're not in this room, and they're at scale. And they have requirements of what they collect. And it's mostly, it's down to like no meat, because I think it goes to pigs. It's like a meat regulated zone.
yeah.
Anyway, so I just point out that it's there.
So
Plus,
that-
there,
I think that's actually, well, keep going.
I just want to add one other thing. This came up in the Universe Recycling Stakeholder Group of several years ago, maybe 4 years ago now. There are those that depackage dry goods and liquid goods for animal feed. That happens in other states. I don't know if material from Vermont is going that way. I know there are animal feed haulers that are large scale that take stuff. I don't know if it has packaging.
There's material from Vermont that's going to animal feed outside of the state.
Yeah, no doubt. No, yeah. I just don't know if it's done with the depackaging associated with it. I know it has happened in Massachusetts. I don't know if that's
Happens a
still.
lot in New York as well.
Yeah.
Where the-
So with the example that Josh was just giving, there is, there's an out-of-state company that is in Vermont hauling out of grocery stores for livestock feed. They don't take meat. So in that case, as I think about how the hierarchy works, like somebody is not willing and able to utilize that meat, at least in this scenario, for animal feed. So then they would need to find a secondary use and application for that meat to then send. So they've achieved hopefully they've achieved food donation up top. Then they achieved, separating for animals. And then if they have that meat material, then they should be finding, in this case, it was a larger grocery store. They should be setting up with a contractor to take that material to the next thing on the hierarchy. I think in the case that we're both thinking of, they weren't doing that. They never got to that. So the meat was never found its way into any meaningful use, but in theory, I think it would have. I don't know for a fact one way or the other, but I don't.
I don't know the answer to that.
I think the other piece for me on the de minimis part, right? You said that there's
Yeah.
de minimis, but
Yeah.
if you're going to if we're doing a route and we're picking up 1,000 customers and each person puts in a couple cans of food, when it gets back to the transfer station, at that point, is it still de minimis? Because right when you're looking at it, you're gonna go.
Yeah,
What
but
are
to
you-
that,
what are you doing?
but to that, no, totally, no, legit, that's a legitimate point. When we usually see it, it's in individual garbage bags, and you don't see anything. But then the case that we did see, it was like Gleason Road, we saw crackers come through, and it was just unquestionable, it was just like the packer emptied out, and it was just like all crackers. There was bags of garbage too, bags of crackers that busted open, but in that case, it was clear that something had gone awry with that generator. And we followed back up, and it was, you could see who the generator was, the name was on everything.
I know exactly.
Yeah, so that like worked out pretty clearly.
Gotcha.
But I think there could be a case made that those are from individual generators. I mean,
Yeah.
I think you're right on. Let me go to Jenna and Billy in case we've been talking in here and you guys haven't had a word in edgewise. I just want to make sure you get a chance to speak.
No, I'm good.
Yeah, I'm okay.
Steve, again, this is your meeting, so.
Yeah, I guess I think, if there is other options besides like option B that's laid out on here, that would be a better method to keep some of those contaminants out of animal feed. I mean, I think we should definitely have that conversation and try and understand what those methods would be.
Essentially, what this boils down to, these three things, is how do you support higher up parts of the hierarchy more firmly? And how do you address the challenges of heavily packaged food and the challenges of source separating and the time it takes to do that? And where does that line meet, where someone gets a decision made about what's source separated and what's not? That's what it's trying to wrestle with. I don't know that it's perfect. It's just a starting point.
Well, it seems if the goal is to stick the hierarchy, so that we've got as much flexibility in getting those upper echelons answered first, that mandated source separation would be the way to do that, in my mind. Because the minute you don't require that, you're inevitably, I think, degrading the quality and the options for some portion of that stream and where it will end up. I don't know if that's 20% of the stream. It's obviously going to depend on the generator, but I think it's a significant amount. Just thinking about the examples in our field, when the first big grocer decided to send all of their food waste to Depack, it was something like 12% of our incoming tonnage was gone in a day without much warning for you or anybody else. Right.
That's why I'm asking.
But then now that material, it can't go to a compost facility because they're allowing everybody to commingle, and presumably there's food that would be fit for animals in there. I know from Tom's experience that there's food for animals in that stream, and probably, I think
There's usually food for people. in a lot of these-
almost.
I mean, sometimes it's the cakes and it's not, and sometimes it's
Or
apples.
just the produce,
Like the whole produce section,
the
yeah.
produce that pulled out of those trucks is unbelievably good, unbelievably hard not to eat, even though it's falling on your.
It's very easy to eat.
But my point being that there's a lot in there that is now not eligible for all those, first two options, or three options, potentially because it's being commingled. And I'm sure the generators prefer, if we hear from Hannaford, they're gonna say that, well, this is way more efficient. We're able to do a much better job. We're able to up our donation as a result or whatever it is, but they were doing it before. It, they're a big organization. Anybody who supports the grocery store that large, probably, I know they all run tight margins, but they, I would think that would be of all the ways to get to more food for these upper things, I think that would be the easiest way to do it.
Just want to note that Caroline has her hand up, but Aaron, go ahead and respond to that and then I'll.
Sorry, what do you mean easiest way to?
Easiest way to ensure that there's more food available for people, for animals, for composting, or anaerobic digestion that doesn't require depackaging.
Going with option B.
Yeah,
On page.
or a version of that, probably, yeah.
So can we unpack that option B? I apologize, everybody. So go through, if you can't donate to people, you.
Or you have a
stated-
donation program.
Yep.
You check that box.
Yep.
Let's just say hypothetically.
So generator must send any remaining unpackaged source separated food residual. So what are we talking about? Unpackaged source separated food residual to a facility.
Be at a large grocer with what, like a 1 ton threshold, which was, I didn't even start there, but that's sort of where this is envisioned. You would have the lettuce, the zucchinis, the meat, the deli stuff, cutoffs, the bone, baked goods.
Not the yogurt cups,
Not the yogurt cups,
freezer packaging.
right?
stuff,
Not frozen
canned,
foods, not the
the-
canned goods. I mean, you would have to define what is heavily packaged, which is not an easy thing. The packaging world, you guys know, as waste managers, is unstoppable. It feels like sometimes, but anyway, go ahead.
But I would say that category ought to, the source separated stuff ought to include things like deli sandwiches that's just in a piece of cellophane, or like a clamshell piece of cake or something that's expired. Like open the clamshell, dump the source separate the piece of cake from the stream. I think it should include stuff like that, the easily depackaged stuff.
Can I ask a question?
Yes,
I mean,
Billy, yeah.
I think it's easy to say that's easy to do.
Right.
But what's the actual process and what's the burden on those generators who have more than one sandwich that they need to separate from the cellophane? So we can say that source separation is obviously the highest option for maintaining the integrity of the material and reducing the amount of contamination. But the reality is, and my question really is to Aaron, and I guess to the Hannaford folks who will be coming in, is that even possible? Do they have enough staff to do that? Do they have enough space to do that?
Yeah.
I mean, how long does it take to separate a sandwich from cellophane? And how much does that cost? And what's
Right.
the opportunity cost for them doing that? So I think those are,
Yeah.
it is easy, but what is
It's easy
realistic?
for us to say it's easy, right? But operationally, and thank you, Billy. That's exactly where my mind was headed. It's, these, yes, they're grocery stores that provide access to food. They're not redemption centers, right? There's not space or capacity within those stores for people to stand in a line and unpackage product. And where is that threshold?
I think,
That's a
I
good
think the
point.
whole, go ahead, Ben.
I was just going to say, I think that's all a good point. I'm curious to hear when we do speak to a grocer what their thoughts are on it. I think from my standpoint, and just understanding the hierarchy from working with it over the years, I think requiring some amount of easily depackaged food, and I'm using that term, I know you guys disagree with it, but just hear me out on it. Requiring some sort of easily depackaged food, like the deli sandwiches and the clamshell stuff, at the point of generation, it motivates the generator to reduce the waste to begin with. So it sort of upholds the structure of the hierarchy. Because then they're going to say, hey, we have like way too many sandwiches that we have to unwrap here. Let's figure out a way that we can have less waste. And then there'll be a system that either it's reduced price and it moves and it gets sold and people eat it, or they have less sandwiches that they make. And either way, I think that's a win. And I think secondarily, if you're taking the sandwich off the shelf anyways to throw it in a bucket of commingled with packaging, or the clamshell of whatever it is, a baguette or whatever, not a baguette, a croissant. I think it's pretty easy to pop it open and put it in the source separated food scraps bins. But I think it'd be interesting to hear from the grocers on it.
That's what led us to this point. Hannaford's
Well, yeah,
came to a stakeholder meeting in 2019 and talked about the benefits of commingling these materials from a cost and a labor perspective.
Yeah.
And that's why they were using AgriCycle to manage their food waste, because AgriCycle was offering that service. That's how we got here today.
Let's
And
go
I
to
think-
Tom and then go to Caroline.
that's a great point, and I think, one thing that's really helpful is to remember that most of these grocery stores were source separating for over a decade before we allowed depackaging in Vermont. So,
Not just Vermont though, Tom. It wasn't, that was happening. That depackaging, what Hannaford's was doing, or what their food waste was happening before we put our depackaging facility in.
oh yeah, absolutely.
So you can't narrow it down to just what's happening here.
No, I'm saying what's happening in terms of what was allowed here, not
Fair enough.
with facilities here. So for nearly a decade, Hannaford's, I had Hannaford's accounts, I had Price Chopper accounts. They were doing, Hannaford's was the golden child. In fact, we did time studies on some of these things. So we even had them picking PLU stickers off of fruit. The Swanton Hannaford's, we did a time study there. It took 2.5 hours for an entire week to pick every PLU sticker coming off of out of their produce section. It's less than it's basically a half hour a day. You think about what people are making on the floor there, it really wasn't a huge cost to them. They were more than happy to do it. They only changed that policy when somebody from out of state, from their main office, came to Vermont, said, wow, no other state is doing this. And it was only at that point that things started they started backing off of those things. So I think that there is, we have to remember that vision statement we established at the beginning, that idea that we're trying to create something that innovates into a space where the world is different than it is right now. And it's going to require us to change our behaviors. And let's not forget that we did change them. And the convenience that we're experiencing now is newer, and we were able to do it before. There may have been some materials we weren't recovering that Depack is the perfect scenario for, but that doesn't mean that the whole, that we have to condemn everything to getting blended together per se. And I think, really a lot of these things come down to the question of like, where are the appropriate exemptions from the hierarchy? Like if the hierarchy as it is something that basically sort of represents the way that we would like materials to generally be handled when it's possible, then I think the question is like establish that, confirm that, and then start looking at like what are those conditions under which it's an unreasonable bar to reach, and create common understanding about when it would be appropriate for somebody to do something different than that because of specific circumstances.
Caroline? Thanks. Caroline, go ahead, but you're on mute. You're still on mute.
Button response.
Oh, there you go. We heard you for like a split second there. All right. Oh, I just saw you're on mute.
This is how quick my computer responds to when I hit a button. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My goodness. Yeah, I wanted to chime into the sandwich debate as assistant manager of our local South Rolton market. The food residual subject is indeed a manifold one in the grocer's perspective. deli items in clamshells would never be disposed of in the compost bin the day they're outdated. They're not eligible anymore for donation, but it's sort of a internal benefit system to our staff to allow access to those pulled deli items, considering the price of the items in the on the bin for imagine you every time you work you spend the $10 on a lunch. Our staff really greatly benefits from having the outdated food available, and it's greatly used. And then after that, staff takes the outdated items from the staff fridge when a couple days have passed, and then empties all that out into the compost bin outside, and washes what needs to be washed and recycles what can be recycled. And similarly, in the produce section, that's food that can be donated if it's not damaged, though. That's more of the co-op donating food that is sort of not as pretty anymore. Food that actually there has to be pulled also is not really fit for human consumption officially anymore, but also their staff really takes home a lot of that. And some staff members have livestock, so some of that also lands in animal consumption. But with the animal piece, again, that's really, I think, often the question of what service are even available, and then can the regulations be met? And maybe the group would like to hear more about that from Stephanie Smith from the agency, because food processing residuals, and many of them are being used for animal feed. That's like kind of its own can of worms, and it's already regulated differently. So that's why this is not really subject of the regulatory recommendations this group might want to make, as it's subject of current rulemaking. But yeah, and then it's great that there's more services available in terms of diverting it for composting in the small scale also, and that's easily accessible for most of the items that fall on. And with grocery items, generally, it's such a finicky issue as well, because every manufacturer has their own policies about what they need to kind of reimburse items that couldn't be sold to the store. And sometimes the co-op allowed, for example, for staff to take home bread that is outdated, but we have to keep the label, and other bread we can't take home because for example, Red Hen Bakery donates their food, their bread that they couldn't sell, and they pick it up again themselves. They have their own system. And then other food items we can't give home to take. The cookies, cupcakes that staff would love to eat can't be eaten because of the manufacturer's policy around the reimbursement policy. So it's a complex issue. So I would just say from the recommendations I see here today, that one about keeping records of the pounds of food recovered, I think that would really be a disincentive to recover. It would be an instrumentable amount and keep regular track of this complex system I'm describing here. I would rather see something like a strategic plan a store could potentially have, similar to the greenhouse gas emission reductions goals that Ben and Jerry described. Something like a strategic plan where kind of efforts are being made transparent and goals are being set to improve those. Might make more sense, and more guidance, of course, of what is really the judgment call for a service to be available or not.
Thanks, Caroline. I don't know what a strategic plan would look like, but maybe we'll get into that. We have about a half hour left. I just want to mention that if anybody, this is a good conversation, we can keep going, or if anyone wants to take a break, let me know. Kim, you had a comment. Go.
No, I didn't.
Oh, okay. Billy, go ahead.
I have a question that's still pertaining to this issue, and I guess there's been talk of, 10 years ago, the grocers were able to separate this material. And if the answer is not available today, I'd just like to table the question. But what are the full-time employee? What are the FTE equivalencies for grocers today compared with what they were in 2012? not being an economist or a labor expert, I'm going to guess that there are fewer people working in each grocery store than were 10 years ago. And I think that's based on just anecdotally, and I think we all have been bagging our own groceries for at least the last decade because there just aren't enough staff there. So I think it would be helpful to this discussion to understand, do they have the same number of employees per square foot or per store that they had 10 years ago? Because that's a resource that's going to contribute to trying to solve this problem. And if the answer is that they don't, then the question is, are we putting an additional burden on our grocers? In addition to bagging our groceries, are people also willing to also, step up and separate that clamshell from the material in it? Is that a direction that we'd be asking to go?
Well, you can check on that.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to share that,
Or we can hear from
wages,
some.
we can certainly get some additional information, but, having surveyed our membership, wages between now compared to 10 years ago, it's at least 35% higher now. Yes, the number of employees today is significantly lower than the number of employees working 10 years ago. I don't have that percentage difference, but we could certainly get that information. But yeah, the other issue is workers don't want to separate things. That they would much prefer working with customers. They see that as a significantly lower priority on their job description. It's not an ideal job. And I think that also weighs into whether grocers would have that capacity.
High turnover. In other words.
Very much so.
Well, just as a time check, sorry, I'm getting hoarse. We certainly got into it with this draft policy ideas. We'll call them policy ideas. I think where you guys are headed right now are to hear from some speakers, and then start to see if you have recommendations or if there's things that are going to be disparate where one recommends this, other recommends the exact opposite. We'll put that into the report and let it stand as it is, which is a possible outcome, which I think you just have to be open to whatever the outcomes are for this group. If you want to do anything in a different format, or you want to, I mean, there was a discussion earlier about decision making. Please let us know how we can support you there. I neglected to point out, we do have a campaign that I've talked about before. Started calling it Cleaner Compost, and our media person called it that. That is about to launch right now, like any day now, on Front Porch Forum, on YouTube, Google, television, and then television that you buy online, like Hulu and stuff like that. And it has a VPR component as well, but that's pretty much stuff we've done before. So that will be, and I can present that to this group if you'd like, with the imagery. I didn't have myself prepared to do that today, and I apologize. It's essentially on getting people to think about, it's like the recycling, like you live here campaign, getting people to reduce contamination in the food waste stream, whatever stream it is. So that's an aside, but what do you guys want to do for your next meeting? And Ben, who do we have possibly who could come to the next meeting?
Well, this is a little bit of the trouble, and I mentioned it in the email this morning. Based off the rankings that people submitted to me, I identified 7 top picks, which I think I included in the email on Monday. We've got committal from at least 5 of the 7 right now, and tentatively on 2 more. That's way too much. That's more than we have time for, I would say, in 2 meetings. So I don't know what the group wants to do, if you want to pare it down a little bit, or if we want to get creative with other ways to have the speakers present, but let us know.
You guys want to spend more time next time on this stuff? Like, by this stuff, I mean these ideas. I will note for Jenna, I apologize for just calling you out, but I wanted to note that I didn't talk about food manufacturing businesses or businesses like Ben and Jerry's. We spent a lot of times on the grocery sector. I think where a manufacturer like Ben and Jerry's might fall, or others, there's many in Vermont, essentially you would have product that you could donate and product you couldn't donate, and you would maintain whatever records you could of that process. You could have product that you could feed animals or that you couldn't. And then on source separation, there's a chance for a waiver on hard to, heavily packaged foods. And so one could consider that you might submit for that type of a waiver in that scenario. And I'm literally just calling this out for the debate, for the openness of debate, so you can understand what we were envisioning when we put this together. But do folks want to go bring speakers? Do you want us to share the screen? Ben can bring up who those speakers are if you want to talk about that for the next meeting. I just think we need some direction from you, though. Otherwise, we're making it up and it's not an easy place to be.
So I'm happy to chime in. I think that this is helpful in starting the conversation. So thank you guys for putting this together. But I think that hearing from speakers on this will help us to continue that conversation.
Okay.
And bring us to the decision making.
Ben, can you, in the background, get ready to share your screen on who those 5 to 7 people are? Because to that point, Aaron, I think some of them are like health experts.
Yep.
And they may not get into the weeds on what a generator should do or shouldn't do.
Right.
They're going to be like, in my wheelhouse, I can say this, or they're scientific soil expert, whatever, which is fine. I just want to be cognizant, but then someone else who, like Brent Demers, who works at a grocer, might be able to comment on this
Yes.
because it would directly affect.
I see 5 that are PFAS related, I think. I wonder if 5 is, I think I heard 5 would be the max we would want to try to fit into one meeting. Did I hear that
Well,
right?
There's 2 meetings left. Yeah,
There's only 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I don't think we need to hear from 5 people.
Well, I was gonna say, yeah, like, let's hear from Brent and let's hear from Hannaford's if they're available, and let's hear from,
To your point on manufacturers, I'd like to hear from a food manufacturer.
Other than Jenna, which is fine. I just
Um,
want,
It might be helpful to have a smaller generator.
okay.
I'm happy to put anyone in touch with the specialty food producer.
Yeah.
also.
Yeah, or do you have anybody in mind from that?
Well,
Maybe you want to think and
yeah,
shoot us some names or
Yeah.
something?
so we're adding to the 7. But, so if that, I think we're up to 9-ish, because I said Hannaford and you said the manufacturer. But maybe we could just push some of these to the second meeting where I'm guessing we'll come back to things like wanting to know more about PFAS and DPAC and what. Like it's question number 3 is,
Ben, can you make that a little bigger? Like maybe open up just that email and Max answer?
You guys, you picky? Josh, come on. Let's see if I can do it this way.
I can't read it.
And let's see here. Oh, by zooming in.
You're doing it. Thank you. Keep going. Keep going.
I mean, I want to hear from all of them, but.
Yeah.
But if we indeed only have 2 meetings left,
could those related to PFAS, could it be an open discussion? Like have them all at the same time, and then we have instead of having one person present at a time.
I think if we think this part is complicated, we haven't even begun to scratch the surface. Like, so I think I don't think we can aggregate that, like have a panel or something.
But I
We-
mean,
Okay, so
you could separate out grocer type people or
like
generator type
operational
people from
versus
scientist type people, if that's what you were getting at. I don't know.
Depending on what the charge of the group is the hierarchy and this, what role depackaging has. Why are you bringing, I speak to myself.
I mean, I think PFAS is important. It's embedded in a lot of these packaging products.
And stuff that gets source separated. Compost.
But I mean, source separation is part of the scope of the conversation. So I think we have, if there is a potential for the reason for source separation is pollution mitigation. So microplastics.
Maybe,
PFAS,
right?
What's that?
Maybe.
Right, because come on, I just want to do work here, man.
I do too.
Well, yeah, I think we all do,
To,
but
to that point, though, I mean, this participant group gets to decide who your speakers are. So you have a list right now, and Ben, there's nobody on number 5 unless there's someone from EPA that you.
I'm in talks with somebody from EPA. It seems like a really good candidate, actually. Just looked into it.
Okay, thank you.
But to be fair, we did ask everybody to chime in on who you wanted to hear from, and we didn't hear back from a lot of people. So this is just what we heard back from. So just want to point that out. We've been
So
working off your recommendations.
you guys can discuss this list, and you can discuss how you want it.
Yeah, I'd like to put Eric Roy on there. I know I brought him up at another point, but maybe he could do it with Raju because they work together well. So
Is he on sabbatical still, Mike? Last I heard he was out.
he is, but you could have Kate. She's the grad assistant that's doing a lot of the research with him. But I'll reach back out to him.
I think the PFAS stuff is all very related and everybody's very curious about it. And it's gonna take a lot of time. Don't throw anything, but what if we had a separate hour and a half where we were just focusing on like trying to get those 5 people? Could have all be web-based. But then we could add, leave enough time for some questioning. I don't know. I don't want to do another meeting either, but it wouldn't require every time we get together and do this, it's a lot of work from the agency to get us ready for this and then recover from whatever we throw at them. Whereas if the work's already done to line up these speakers, I don't want to lose that. And I think it's all relevant. And, I don't think that we're gonna, our biggest constraint is time and we don't have much of it. So I think it's clear, we're on a roll and I want to hear from the grocer folks. And it seems like prioritizing that for the next meeting and manufacturers perhaps makes sense, but.
Maybe we go from who you're, sounds like nobody's opposed to the grocer and the small manufacturer. Is that what I'm hearing?
I mean, if we're limiting ourselves to 5, I do think we have a manufacturer in the group. So, it might not be, I think a grocer would be great. I guess that wouldn't seem as high of a priority.
Billy and Jenna, feel free to chime in. I know this is difficult to unmute and stuff, but. All right, well, I was merely, sorry to interrupt you, Dan. I was merely trying to okay, what if we go in the negative approach and we
Take people
sort
out.
it that way? I was like, what do people disagree with or they find there was a guy who had an idea about we're not going to put my veto out on the, I won't stand in the way of it, so I'll let that person through. So I don't know how you want to approach this.
The study that ANR is doing, aren't you on a separate but parallel path to
Yes.
PFAS and microplastics?
Yes.
And it's not gonna take a really long time to get any result from that.
The P2 grant, Ben, when does that end? What's the horizon on that?
Sampling 2023.
Report 24.
Yeah, I mean, we'd have raw data pretty quickly, but the report probably 2024.
Yeah, so I don't know. I think it does feed into this. I think the people who aren't at this table who are interested, I bet a lot of them are interested in it from that angle of PFAS and microplastics. So if we look at the larger stakeholder group, I think it would be a mistake, I think, to ignore it and leave it out or, I think it is a time thing, but I would say, let's try to hear from most of that list, or at least I don't know, it'd be hard to figure out who. And also, let's make sure that we're hearing from the grocers and the people we already mentioned, in addition to who's on that list right now.
So you're thinking of a next meeting go big on speakers, all of them. I mean, maybe not all of them, but I mean, all speaker focused, get them all in that one meeting if we can.
Sounds like they're lined up and I think we'd be.
And Ben will say how much time we could allot each person
Well,
in that case.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, certain speakers are not available on the 9th, and they're only available on the 30th, so I don't know if that would work for everybody. That might narrow it down naturally, I don't know.
So how many people are available for the next one?
Good question. I think Dr. Vos and Brent were out for the next one. They said the 30th. I think everybody else, Dr. Bodyready, Kyla Bennett, and they said they could probably go next time around on the 9th. The other ones we're still trying to figure out. People are out of the country and tracking people down is tricky.
I mean, maybe we just take what we can get.
Can get initially. Ben, can I see that list again? I'm sorry to ask you to do that. Stop me, anybody. You can ask for things. I don't even be driving the ship. Mike,
I think for me too, like the draft is helpful because at least we have concrete ideas.
Right.
I didn't get to review it this morning, obviously.
sorry.
A lot of other things going on as well, but I think if we can come back with kind of our edits or suggestions to this, maybe hear from the speakers. And I don't know if we do this. I just feel like we're not gonna have enough time to vet some of these things by giving a full report. I think we can give really good guidance on these and have like a draft that hopefully everyone agrees to, but I do think there's still some people that are saying it shouldn't be a mandate, some saying it should be. I know we're gonna be on opposite sides on that. In my personal opinion, I think there's a divide between the group, just calling that out right now.
Right.
And maybe it's, hey, can we get something that's a framework for them and then present that at the legislative session, but then keep it going after to like really dig into more details on these things so that we are clarifying them, because I do think there are unintended consequences on our end, just from the hauling perspective, that will have it ripple out to all the customers that we serve from an economic and the people standpoint, things like that.
So there's a lot baked into what you were saying, Mike, in that you wanted to keep going on the drafting of policy.
Exactly. Have the speakers come in, we can talk through with the speakers, but at least everyone has the draft now, then we can edit the draft and then take maybe a good chunk of time at one of the meetings to like kind of finalize the draft as to.
This is not a draft of like actual, like this is like a
Bunch of
breakdown.
ideas.
Yeah,
Just
like, yeah.
Suggestion, and then we can
Yeah.
all have our kind of bullet points to say, okay. this may work,
Yeah,
this may not.
you guys can throw it all out. It's just spaghetti at the wall.
No, this is great though, because this gives us a framework.
Okay. On the speakers, Ben, who on this list could come next time?
Dr. Bodyready, as long as it's after 10:35, because he's got a morning class, and then Kyla Bennett seemed like she could also make the next meeting for sure. Those are the ones I know for sure. I know Sarah Vos from VDH and Brent Demers said they could not make the 9th, so they could only make the 30th. The other ones I still have to piece in.
Okay.
I mean, I can reach out to Hannaford
You guys want to include Hannaford in that? Yeah,
or Robert or Sean.
I mean,
or whoever can be, or Brent was on the list, but he couldn't make it. That's right.
I don't know.
Ben said he already told him.
There's been a lot of talk about Hannaford, so I don't.
Steve, sorry. I didn't know.
No,
I'd say one of the big three, certainly, and also be nice to have somebody like Brent who can speak true, less than big, medium.
So that would be three, whoever you can get from a grocer's perspective, and then 2 scientists on PFAS and environmental stuff. I'm sorry, I'm not being very clear. It's late in the day. That seems possible. Aaron, are you able to try and line that up?
Yeah,
We can help you. If you,
I'll just send an email and copy Ben right now.
okay, so then that person, those people could be at the front of the agenda, back of the agenda, and then go deeper on the text. What's your preference?
speakers first and work through the draft
And then get
and
into it.
bullet points.
Okay.
Second would be my thought.
maybe one thing everybody could consider between now and then that we could specifically come back to is, this is all very helpful. I agree. We also have a a draft that is in in statute. And I don't want to forget that that exists. And so I think one of the questions might be too, where within that is further clarification or appropriate exemptions sort of required or would benefit from? Like, I think that's what's in statute. So that's really what we have to react to. And where there are like really meaningful reasons where we would provide an exemption for that. I think those are the things that we should be sort of like focusing on defining as we go. So maybe just making sure everybody's really read the hierarchy and is focusing on sort of where those carve outs need to be. And not like, I don't think we're intending to start over here.
Right. And a lot of this is very, very simple language instead of statutory stuff. Mike's right. There's probably some unintended consequences in the way it's written or things it doesn't envision. Yeah, so we can try and help there. I think if we get into statute too deeply, though, it's very hard to then keep it high level. But I agree with you. This essentially would tie into the hierarchy and tie into what generators would have to do. And I just put a number B on number 3, which is source separation. B is like statute is clarified. That's all. That's all it says. So obviously, there would be more text that would need to be added. Yeah, essentially, I would be in and suggesting something change if that's what you want to do.
Any way to get more input on what lightly versus heavily packaged foods, like more examples, because seems like that could be important.
You think my guys aren't gonna be able to figure lightly versus heavily?
I think that's something that like with the grocery store reps, you know, they have a pretty good sense of their material. They could kind of help break things down into categories. We've played around before with questions of like ratios, you know,
Packaging.
product versus package size, you know, so a single serve thing has a very small amount of product in it versus a lot of packaging.
Rather than material type or time required. Or...
Well, and I think maybe this is something, and maybe A&R's already done this, looking at examples in places like Germany or in Europe where there may be some existing rubrics already created, but like, you know, I think packaging to product ratio would be potentially one thing to consider. Layers of packaging. So is it a potato chip bag where it's like, and you empty it, or that clamshell that Ben was describing, or is it something that's got 4 layers of packaging to get to the product?
Box of individual potato chips.
Right. Yeah. So they're, you know, I think one of the examples, like I think Casella handles like these really little baby formula containers. So you know, I think an example is saying that's high packaging rate to product.
Those words can be added easily. I think what we might want to do is, Ben and I talked about this, and we apologize for coming up with this so late in the game. We partly didn't, I actually finished this yesterday afternoon. What I'm getting at is we lumped it all into one document. It might be good to break out what I'll call page 2 and on material into a separate document so you can start playing around with it, your own draft as you'd like. You can have a shared draft. You can do it in your own silos, whatever you want to do. We can put that on the shared website or the FTP site or both. It's really up to you guys what you want us to do. But essentially, it's exactly what you're saying, Tom. You need to play with the statute. Mike, you need to get in there and make your edits. Aaron, Dan, Steve, Jenna, and Billy as well.
You, just like everybody else, you have a lot on your plate. So thank you for putting this together, whether you did it last night or 3 weeks ago. It doesn't matter. Thank you for doing it. I feel like I need to digest this and make notes and get feedback.
Yep.
Everybody else, others are welcome to share their edits, but I need to understand it.
So feel free to take that Word doc that you have access to, cut and paste this piece out. We can come to the next meeting with just this piece. You can ask us to add things to it. We can just keep a running list at the back of that of other ideas. Like obviously, the additional considerations is extremely brief. You could add a whole bunch of other things.
So operationally, then, is it easier if we all were able to share a Google Doc so that we aren't
wonder
having
if
to add,
that's-
We're not allowed to use Google. Docs.
I know.
Yeah, you all
You can.
We can.
or whatever, an editable document, so that we
Ben,
don't,
what's the
we don't have to keep bugging Leah and Ben?
The FTP site doesn't allow, it's not like a Google Doc, right?
No, it's for uploading and downloading only. So you
Okay.
can't have multiple people working on the document at the same time, unfortunately.
So I recommend that we post the doc in both places so that, you know, the original document will be on the website that the public has access to as well, and for us to also reference. And as far as editing the document, I'm open to suggestions for a process we can use since we're not allowed to use Google Docs.
Well, I think we can use it. One of us could upload it to Google Docs and invite everybody else and just exclude our friends of the state who can't participate.
When we say
Okay.
it, what are we talking about? Right?
Well, that's a good question. Like this draft of ideas that's been thrown together, I would recommend, based on your earlier question, that we do take out the first page and a half and make it its own thing, because I think they're all ambitious, great ambitions, and probably would agree on almost all of them. Whereas the meaty stuff on the, the last page and a half could be its own thing. We could call that something.
I mean, I think really we should be working off of the statute and
Right.
building out from that. You guys did great work. I appreciate it. But this is not a policy. This is just a couple things slapped in here from something else. It's not something to, there may be parts of this that we want to then amend the existing statute with. But I don't think we're starting over. We've only been asked the question of whom should this apply, And that's, I think, really the question that we're like need to come back to as we do this. And so maybe we upload the statute and then start building in recommendations for how to interpret for whom this applies to.
What if we upload the statute or the relevant parts that are of concern, the first half of this document, and then add like some division, and then below it, the stuff that we've just been given today, and one that we all have thoughts on edits, and then try to somehow eventually combine them into a more thing, like one legible document that takes the pieces that we're thinking are important to clarify and throw them into the statute language.
I hesitate to volunteer, but because there's a problem, because I can do that. I could take the statute, copy it, and add some of it. The problem is, which is fine, finding the right homes for some of the ideation that's in here won't be obvious right away and will require legal counsel. But I don't think that matters that much. You guys are supposed to come up with recommendations. I'm happy to do whatever you guys want. If you want to start from statute, that's fine. I think it's just more complicated because then you're talking about, well, what did you change in statute? Then you have to have the different lines so that you know what you did and didn't do. I don't know. Because at some point,
I think we're just trying to get the principles right. So I guess that's what I'm trying to knock it down into. Like, I think we want to work from a broad perspective down to a detailed perspective, So.
Would Tom, could you take the relevant portions of the statute that are most important for us to focus on and put it in the top of this document that we would all have potentially access to on Google, and have that at a minimum as a reference so that we can scroll up and see, oh yeah, that's where that will make most sense, but still enable everybody else to work in the lower sections as they currently stand and will be modified? I don't.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind doing it, like cut and paste from the statute,
Yes.
put it in there and if it's just a matter of creating the space for people to then plug in.
I think the only relevant part is on the hierarchy part. And right now, source separation is a definition. And it's referenced in the hierarchy part too. But not as, I think it just says separate from other solid waste. So it doesn't call it out as source separation. So those would be, so it really is all about that hierarchy section. And then, so you would be this would be new. So I think you could do what you said.
I'd add to this conversation, I mean, looking at Act 170, The second charge is whether the Agency of Natural Resources should modify its existing policy surrounding the source separation of organic waste. I think that's a little more broad than just statute, because we get into that policy document from previous meetings. So I hear what you're saying, and I do think focusing on the intent, keeping it narrow makes sense, but it's also pretty clear it's a charge to make a comment on policy of source separation.
Two separate things, right? The hierarchy is part of the statute, and then the policy is developed after the law passed. So that's on committee that you just held on.
I think it's good that you reference it, Steve. I think it gets a little confusing. The reason I even started on page three, sorry. Yeah, on page 3 with source separation A&R's policy document is basically replaced, is because it's simpler just to not have to wordsmith every little piece of that and just kind of say, okay, what's the world you want to create or not create or influence? And so I'm just sort of assuming that it's quicker to go for the visioning and stay broad rather than getting the weeds on that. And to Kim's point, a policy is trying to interpret what's in the statute, as Steve, a colleague who works state government, knows well. And if statute gets clarified by your recommendations, then it's much more clear as to what it should be or shouldn't be. So I don't think I'm disagreeing. The policy is on the website. But again, if you guys get it.
The final and the drafts are all uploaded to the FTP site too, so people can see those documents.
They're in both places. Essentially, the policy allows what is the crux is commingling of packaged and unpackaged food, and draws under criticism source separation in the shortest version.
I think I would agree with what Tom said and putting part of this document up and then putting the statute over top of it. That's what I would like to see.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that.
So that's gonna be on a Google Doc, just to clarify, and then for the next meeting, we could upload whatever that draft looks like with all the comments and iterations into that FTP site, so everybody can see it. Well, I guess that's still not everyone. We can give it to A&R so that they can look at it, and
We can post versions of it to
Yeah.
your live website for the stakeholders to view as you.
Right, that,
Maybe after every meeting, if you've gotten to a place with it, we can do it that way if you want, or it can remain a working document until you
are
get.
you guys literally not allowed to use it at all, or are you not allowed to use it?
Not for, we're not allowed to use it for, we're not supposed to use our computers for non-official work anyway. So yeah.
No, but I mean, like,
You'd have a Google Docs.
like, yeah, can you guys just come in and snoop what this committee is doing and whatnot versus like,
I have
you
to
guys,
use my personal email. Yeah,
I
I
see.
can access it. Yeah. So that's where it gets off.
I get,
I think we can work around it, but I
Yeah.
think for workability for you guys,
It's
if
the
it works
easiest
for you to
thing.
use that,
Yeah.
use it. And then you can send us somebody can send us the latest
Yeah.
version, and,
And
and
we
if
can
it
just
doesn't
look at
include
it.
Aaron's comment, she'll say so, and then we have to come back to
Yeah.
square one, like.
just one point of clarification. I think if we do this, then we will all have editing capability and we'll track what the edits are. But is it okay if we invite people who aren't editing so that they can see it as well, or do we want to avoid that?
I mean, I think if any of us individually want to seek the consult of somebody outside of the group, that's fine.
Share that
Yeah.
saving document, as long as we're not granting
Editing.
editing privileges, because we don't want to lose anything we don't want.
Yeah, I guess I don't see a real reason not to. I don't know. I don't think we want to give anybody else access to the folder just for simplicity. But if you want to share the individual document and seek feedback in your own council, I think that's okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure we
Just
weren't.
make sure someone doesn't delete someone else's comments.
Yeah,
Right, yeah.
Up to like 30 people trying to edit the same
Yeah, I
thing.
think, I think you want to keep it small for you guys for the workability of it. It's gonna be hard enough to work through
Right.
yourselves.
So what I'll do initially is I will just upload or I'll put up the statute and then maybe put in just a couple fields for prompts, just so that we can kind of concentrate our suggestions. Just trying to organize it a little bit, but I won't put any personal pieces. And then in the future I will, and I think we all should just do track changes so that it's clear who's making what suggestion.
Yep. Yeah, and I don't know Google Docs that well, but I think there's an option to suggest an edit versus actually editing. So I don't know if we want to get.
Or just, or comments too. You can
Comment.
raise on everything. Say, here would be my concerns with X, Y, Z, or here's what I think is reasonable.
I mean, it is laudable to try and give the legislature actual statute. It is difficult to do.
Yeah, I don't think trying to give them actual statute, but it's like, well, I just think like the policy conversation we're having should be in reflection to the statute.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. Okay.
That's my only sort of suggestion is making sure that what we're doing is grounded in.
Yep. It's certainly a nice touchstone if people haven't read it and spent time in it. Billy, Jenna, anything from you guys if we talk too much or talked over you or anything?
No, I agree with that idea. Just put it into a Google Doc, limit the amount of people to just the stakeholder team. And just a reminder to folks that there's a difference between the editing function and the reviewing function in Google Docs. Or
Yeah.
what is it? Suggesting and editing. We want to use suggesting to track it. Sorry.
I was just saying, I agree.
Okay. So Ben, I think we can firm up 3 speakers. Aaron will get us the details on the brochure, and we have at least 2 scientists that could make it. So let's firm those up for the beginning. And then the second half of the meeting will be spent on this draft you guys are working on. All right. Well, thanks everybody for.
Do we want Ben to like if anybody else is available, or are we wanting to get people while we have them since we're going to be tight on time?
I think if we can get people, then we should get people. Because we only have 2 more meetings, right?
Yeah.
We're estimating 3, is that right, Ben, at the moment? 3 probable?
Well, 3 that should be confirmed, but potentially 2 or 3 more that could slot into the 9th meeting.
And how much time are we imagining each speaker?
In my solicitation, I said, half hour for a quick presentation and Q&A.
I'll have to cut that down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, because we can always invite people to give us, written in addition to any spoken things.
Right.
Traditionally, these meetings have been 2 hours, right?
Yeah.
So I'm envisioning right now,
Always go over.
kind of
So-
thinking of an hour on speakers and an hour on, I'm just throwing that out there.
Is 15 minutes too little for a speaker?
I don't think so. 10 minutes is a fair amount of time to get, and like, then that, if we gave ourselves then
It's not uncommon in legislative testimony to
Yeah.
given that. amount
You
of
can
time.
say a lot in 15
Well,
minutes.
yeah, it's more about you all having questions in the discussion after.
Well,
So
if
make
they're,
Sure you have that.
if we start with the speakers and they're still there, some of them will be, some of them won't likely, then maybe.
I think in fact, maybe we should really just ask people to keep their prepared comments to 5 minutes. That's a fair amount of time, really. I mean, actually in the legislature, that's typically all we get. And then, yeah.
How about you? No, I'm just
And then but then I think, I think our questions are as important as, and they'll have plenty of time to also offer more input.
I would ask for 10 minutes for prepared comments. I think that's me.
Yeah, how about 5 to 10 minutes?
All right. 5 to 10 minutes, 3 speakers. If we hear from others, we'll put them into the next meeting.
Well, I mean, if it's only 5 to 10 minutes, I think, that's it. There's room for another 1 or 2.
We'll make it work.
So should we just so Ben has a clear, like up to 5 speakers at the next meeting
Yeah.
and we'll short ourselves the discussion time and do a certain amount of this over just ongoing.
Up to 5.
Got it.
All right. All right, well, we're a little over. Thanks, folks who've joined in. Does anybody disagree with, we can stop the meeting now? I just want to ask that question. Okay, we can stop recording.
Adjourned.
Billy, do you have a comment?
Good with it. Nope. Go ahead and stop.
Everybody.
Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep, that's been.
Ben.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Ugh.
No.